Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event about the public opinion and political polarization in Ohio regarding the 2022 general election. I'm John Green. I'm the Emeritus Director of the Bliss Institute at the University of Akron. And over the next 60 minutes, we will describe and discuss the results of the recent Bliss Institute poll. But before I begin, I would like to remind everyone of some virtual meeting etiquette. First, please make sure that your microphone is muted and that your camera is turned off. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation or during our Q&A period after the presentation via the chat function, which is at the top of your Teams screen. Please type in your question and I will do my best to address the questions when the time comes. Feel free to ask anything about the survey, and as you know, I'm happy to speculate about politics in general. Second, please note that this event is being recorded, and we will post the video on our website along with other materials related to the survey. So now let's turn to the survey findings. For the next 30 minutes or so, I will present some basic information of voter attitudes regarding the 2022 general election in Ohio. This information does not really predict the outcome of the election because a lot depends on the candidates and the campaigns, but this information does set the context for the candidates and campaigns that will follow. Turning to our let's see. First, I'd like to cover some just basic information about the poll. This survey was conducted for the Bliss Institute by the Center for Marketing and Opinion Research of Akron, Ohio. It was a random sample of 1,150 Ohio eligible voters. Many of them were registered voters, but we also included people who had not yet registered or that ultimately may not register because we wanted a broader view of public opinion. The survey was conducted entirely online between February 17 and March 15 of 2022. As part of that survey, we asked a number of time-sensitive questions, such as individuals' preferences in the upcoming primary. Those results were released earlier. What we're looking at today are opinions that have a longer shelf life, things that are very unlikely to change in the short run. The margin of error for the survey is plus or minus 2.5%. Well, now for a brief overview of what we'll discuss over the next few minutes. As the 2022 election approaches, our survey reveals that Ohioans prefer Republican control of the federal and Ohio governments, and we'll talk about those measures in just a moment. These views reflect some underlying political factors: partisanship, not surprisingly, assessments of the general conditions of the country and of the state, responses of the federal and state government to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then a series of hot button issues which have become very prominent in recent times, issues that have implications for both the federal and the state government. These include teaching about race in public schools, election reform, growth of federal programs, possible restrictions on abortion, and the immediacy of addressing climate change. The major variable that we'll be looking at in this presentation is Ohioans' attitudes towards the control of the federal and Ohio government. And here on the screen, we can see the actual questions we ask. These are questions we've asked for many years through our polls at the Bliss Institute, and they turn out to be very good measures of generic party preference. Let me just read the one on the left about the federal government. It begins with the statement, "The Democrats control the federal government. This year, would you like to see the Democrats continue to control the federal government, or would you like to see the Republicans take control of the federal government for a change? You can see on the right side, a counterpart to that question was asked about the Republican control of state government. Now, question wording purist might note that our question about the Democrats has a potential logical problem in it, in that the White House is not up for grabs this year. We don't have a presidential election. But we wanted to keep our questions as parallel as possible and as comparable with previous questions. And of course, if Ohioans were to vote for Republican members of the Congress or for the US Senate, that would be an indication that they probably wanted to see Republican control of the federal government. But of course, at the state level, we elect a governor, all of our statewide officers, and including many other legislative and local officials. So how did Ohioans respond to these questions? We're going to see a number of different charts and pictures throughout this presentation. This is an example of one of them. And what it shows us is that in response to the question we just mentioned, or just read, 54% of Ohioans say that they would like Republicans to control the federal government via the 2022 election. A slightly larger majority, 57%, say they would like to see Republicans to continue to control state government. Now, looked at from one point of view, these are not particularly surprising numbers. After all, 2022 is a midterm election, and one of the strongest regularities in American elections is what's called the midterm slump. Whichever party controls the White House tends to have some difficulty in the following midterm election. And of course, that's the situation we're in right now. The Democrats control the White House, and so it's not surprising that here in Ohio and elsewhere, there are some opinions about how the other party, in this case the Republicans, might come back into control. The more interesting feature, though, is what are the factors that are associated with this kind of opinion? Well, one of them, not surprisingly, is party identification and the favorability that people have towards the major parties. After all, the way we ask this question is about partisan control, Democrats versus Republicans. This is kind of a complicated chart. I promise you the ones that follow are not so complicated, but it shows two different but related things. The line graph across the middle of the chart shows the distribution of party identification, ranging from strong Democrats on the left over to strong Republicans on the right, and the pure independents in the middle. For purposes of this chart, I've lumped those who are independents but lean towards the Democratic Party or lean towards the Republican Party to the partisan categories. So we have strong Democrats, independents, Republicans, and strong Republicans. As you can see in this survey, the Republicans have an edge in party identification. This is unusual in Ohio. Generally, the parties are very evenly balanced, and in recent times, Democrats have had something of an advantage in party identification. This may be peculiar to this individual survey, but a whole series of surveys in Ohio and across the nation show this shift in a Republican direction. So it's not just that individuals want Republicans to be in control of the federal and state government, they're also identifying more Republican than in the past. The other part of the chart, the bars, the blue bars that point up and the red bars that point down, show the net favorability towards the Democratic and Republican Party across these identification categories. Now, it's not really surprising that lots of strong Democrats would favor their party and lots of strong Republicans would favor theirs. But the reason this picture is important is these figures are much larger than past surveys have shown. Not only do we have some shifts in party identification, but we have some increasing intensity of feelings about the parties. And if you look right in the middle of the chart, you'll see a tiny little red bar. Those are for the independents. Very tiny, within the margin of error bias towards favorability towards the Republican Party. Interestingly enough, if we were to break out the independents, we would find that neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party are particularly popular with independents these days. And that's one of the features of political polarization. In polarization, Democrats move in one direction, Republicans in another direction, and that intensifies their activity and their opinions. But at the same time, many independent voters feel disenfranchised and become disconnected from the major parties. Well, how does this party identification, party favorability relate to these opinions about partisan control of the federal and state government? Well, our next slide shows that. And what we see, not surprisingly, is that individuals, whatever their partisanship, who prefer the Democrats having control of the federal government, have a much more positive view of the Democratic Party. On the other hand, those individuals who would like to see Republican control of the federal government, whether they're identifiers as with the Republican Party or not, have a much more favorable view of the Republican Party. And that's a pretty huge difference from 79% on the Democratic column to, in this case, negative. That's just so we can tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats of 69%. That's a huge swing. Not unusual in midterm elections. But what's interesting is if you look over on the right-hand side of the picture, of the chart, you'll see that while there's a similar pattern in Ohio, the numbers are much smaller. And this is interesting because one of the features of our polarized national politics is that state and local races, as well as national races, have become part of national trends and national attitudes. Well, here we see an example where there does seem to be a significant difference between how Ohioans view Ohio state government versus how they see the federal government. That it helps explain these opinions are assessments of how the country and the state are going. And in this survey, we used a very, very common measure of this. It's called the right track, wrong track. Question usually reads, overall, would you say that the country is on the right track or the wrong track? And here we can see some interesting patterns. When it comes to the country as a whole, 32% of Ohioans said the United States is on the right track, about 1/3. And the balance, about 2/3, said the United States is on the wrong track. Again, not unusual figures for a midterm election against the party that holds the White House. But look down to the lower bar about the state of Ohio. What we see there is a majority of Ohioans feel that Ohio is on the right track. So again, we see a discontinuity between people's attitudes towards the direction of the country and their views towards the state. Well, how does this relate to attitudes towards party control? Well, we'll look at another version of this this chart. We'll see a lot of these charts, and we'll see that when it comes to the federal government, the control of the federal government, the right track, wrong track opinions track very closely with people's preferences for party control of the federal government, with 79% of the people who want the Democrats to stay in control seeing the country as being on the right track, and 69% of the Republicans, people who want the Republicans to be in control, seeing it as on the wrong track. When you look over, though, to the right-hand side of the chart, look at the numbers for Ohio. Of the people who want the Democrats to take control of Ohio government, 48% of them, smaller than other figures in the table, think that the state is on the wrong track. But people who want the Republicans to maintain control of Ohio government, there's a 62% view that the state is on the right track. So once again, a discontinuity between how Ohio voters see the state and how they see the country. This adds a level of complexity to the election and may very well modify some of those partisan divisions that we saw just a moment ago when we looked at party identification and favorability. Another important factor is how voters judge the effectiveness of government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We asked this of both the federal government and the state government. As you can see from this chart, a little less than 17% of Ohioans felt that the federal government had been very effective in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you look over at the other end of the chart, a little over a quarter, 26%, say that the federal government was not at all effective when it came to dealing with the pandemic. But notice that most people, a majority in fact, are in the middle, where the federal government response, in their opinion, was somewhat effective. If you look down towards the bottom of the chart for Ohio government gets a little, state government gets a little better marks. A little over a quarter say that the Ohio government was very effective. A little less than a fifth over on the other side say that it was not at all effective. And again, a small majority believing that there was some effectiveness of the government response to COVID. Well, how is this related to attitudes towards party control of government? This chart deals with that, and we see a different pattern, an interesting one. If you look at people who prefer democratic control of the federal government and also of democratic control of Ohio government, they tend to have a very positive view of those respective governments' response to the pandemic. But if you look at people who want to see Republican control of the federal government and of the state government, they tend to have modestly negative views of the response of those governments. Now, of course, these are aggregate measures. If we could break them out and look at the distribution of opinion, what these figures tell us is that Democrats tend to be more united in a positive evaluation of government response to the pandemic, whereas Republicans tend to be fairly divided on that particular issue. This adds another layer of complexity to the election that may also modify some of those partisan attitudes that we saw earlier when it comes to these questions. Well, what about issues? Well, it turns out that issues play a very important role in public opinion, and we picked 5 hot button issues that we felt had implications for both the federal government and therefore might influence the senatorial or congressional race in Ohio, or might have implications for the state government and might influence voting in state elections. So one of the questions was about the controversy concerning the teaching about race in public schools. And we asked people a first choice question. One option was, as you can see on the screen, the systematic racism of our society must be taught in the public schools. That doesn't mean people are taught to, be systematically racist, but it should be taught about that. The other option was divisive claims about systemic racism in our society should not be taught in the public school. Difficult to ask questions about these hot button issues in the middle of them, but we think this is a pretty good rendering of the controversy. And as you can see, Ohioans are pretty evenly divided, with 51% choosing the first option and 49% choosing the second option. Can't get a lot more divided than that. That difference is well within the margin of error of the poll. Well, how does this issue affect, or how is it associated with attitudes towards partisan control of government? And what you can see is got some pretty stark differences. Individuals who prefer the federal government to be controlled by Democrats and the Ohio government to be controlled by Democrats both tend to adopt that first position, that the systematic racism needs to be something that needs to be addressed in public schools. On the other hand, individuals who prefer the Republican control of the federal government or the state government tend to take the opposite issue, that the divisive versions of those facts should not be taught in the public schools. So an issue that in the election really could cut either way and is clearly closely associated with partisanship in one way or another. We asked about was election reform. I was a little surprised by the results of this question because there's not as much controversy about elections and election reform in Ohio as there is in other states or at the national level. Here again, two options. One option was U.S. elections are being rigged to allow voting fraud and ballot box stuffing. Or fears of voter fraud are exaggerated, and too much regulation may prevent poor and minority voters from voting. Again, almost evenly divided, with 49% choosing the first option and 51% choosing the second option. Well, how does this controversy relate to people's attitudes on the partisan control of the federal and state governments? Well, it's essentially the same picture. A little bit different numbers, but essentially the same pictures. People who favor democratic control of governments tend to adopt the first, well, really it's the second view, which is that views of voter fraud are exaggerated and that reform has to be careful not to exclude people from voting. On the other hand, people who favor Republican control of the federal and state governments tend to take the opposite view, that there are efforts, perhaps not in Ohio, but in other states, to influence the elections in a way that would allow for greater levels of voter fraud. Another question we looked at was the growth of federal programs, partly due to COVID, but partly due to other factors. There has been an increase in the size and scope of federal programs, social programs, as well as regulatory programs. Some of these things have been enacted, some of these things have only been proposed, but it's become a controversy across the country. Here again, we had two options. One option was the steady growth of federal programs will turn the United States into a socialist country. Or fear of socialism is exaggerated and limiting federal programs will delay justice in the country. Here there's a slight majority picking the first option, but still really pretty even division. The difference between opinion on these two items is just about at the size of the margin of error. So really a close division on this particular issue. Well, how would this play out in terms of people's views towards control of the federal or state governments? You can see another version of this picture, very similar set of numbers. People who prefer democratic control of the federal government and also those who favor democratic control of Ohio government tend to pick the option about the fear of, against the fear of the growth of federal programs, whereas individuals who favor Republican control of the federal government and those who prefer continued Republican control of state government are concerned about the growth in the size and scope of federal programs. You may detect a certain pattern here. These hot button issues are tending to line up in pretty much the same way and may, of course, influence partisan control of government in one way or another, depending on how the election plays out. Another issue that has come to the fore because of cases before the United States Supreme Court are the possibility that state governments, including Ohio, but other states as well, may be able to impose further restrictions on the availability of legal abortions. So we asked a question about that. One option was state governments must be allowed to prohibit abortions after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. The 15 weeks comes from one of the cases before the Supreme Court, a law enacted in the state of Mississippi. Or the other alternative is state governments must not be allowed to prohibit abortions after the first 15 weeks of pregnancy. Once again, we see a pretty even division, slight majority on what might be called a pro-choice position in this particular context. But again, the difference is within the margin, very close to the margin of error of the survey. So pretty even divisions on this particular question among Ohio voters. And again, we see the same basic pattern, although the numbers are not quite as large in this case on the Democratic side, which may suggest that there is a bit more diversity on attitudes towards abortion in the Democratic coalition than in the Republican coalition. But once again, we see that individuals who prefer Democratic control of the federal government and those who prefer Democratic control of Ohio government tend to adopt a more pro-choice position on this controversy before the Supreme Court. On the other hand, those who favor Republican control of the federal and/or state government tend to adopt a more pro-life position on this particular set of issues before the Supreme Court. Finally, we have one more issue we ask about, which was the immediacy of addressing the issue of climate change. Here, one option read, due to the dangers of climate change, it is crucial to take immediate steps to address the issue. Or, the alternative, dangers from climate change are exaggerated and the issue can be addressed steadily over time. So the real difference there is the immediacy of the response to climate change. Here, there wasn't a close division. 61%, 3/5 of Ohioans chose the first option, that is necessary to respond to climate change immediately. On the other hand, only about 2/5, 39% of Ohioans had the opposite view, that these issues could be addressed more slowly over time. But even though there's a clear majority on one side of the way this question was asked, when it comes to their association with partisan control of government, we see a very similar pattern, the now familiar pattern. Individuals that favor Democratic control of these governments tend to be more concerned about an immediate response to climate change, and those who favor Republican control of governments tend to favor a slower, more steady approach to that issue. So, what have our data showed us from this survey? Well, a number of things. First of all, 2022 is likely to be a good Republican year here in Ohio, perhaps across the country. This is not surprising. As we've indicated, this is a pattern that's very strong in American politics. But what's, I think, interesting are the factors in Ohio that are associated with that possibility, whether it would be a very good Republican year or merely just a good Republican year. One of the things we saw is there's a strong impact of partisan divisions. There's been a movement in party identification towards the Republican Party. Whether that's temporary or permanent, we'll have to wait and see. But there's also been increased polarization between the partisans. However, there are some factors that go against the impact of that highly polarized partisanship in Ohio. Part of it is the differential impact of people's assessment of the general conditions of the state and the country. They operate in different ways. Most Ohioans have a more negative view of the conditions of the country and a more positive view of the conditions of the state. There's also a more limited impact on these preferences of people's evaluations of the response of the federal and state government to the COVID-19 pandemic, with Democrats more united in their positive evaluation of federal and state government responses to the pandemic, and the Republicans being having a much more diverse opinion, and in fact, on balance, a negative view of those efforts. At the same time, however, there are at least a few hot-button issues that divide the Ohio electorate very sharply. We don't know if those will be prominent in the campaign, but they could very well be, given the level of attention that these issues are receiving in the state and around the nation. And because of the close division and the close association of those issue positions with preferences for party control of government, those issues could cut one way or the other. It's hard to predict. That's what happens when you have close and even divisions. And of course, it's worth making the point that we made at the outset that these figures that we're showing, this information, it's really about the background to the election. It sets the context for what the candidates and campaigns may do after the primary next week and once the fall campaign gets underway. These are the kinds of factors that candidates and campaigns will have to take into account as they craft their messages to the voters. Well, thank you for your patience in listening to this presentation. And now I'd like to turn to addressing your questions. I hope that there'll be some questions in the chat that I'll be able to answer, but a couple of them have already come up. And so I thought I might start by addressing those questions first. The first is somebody noticed that when it came to issue positions on issue after issue of the 5 hot button issues we looked at, that the Republican opinions tended to be seemed to be much stronger, or at least the opinions of those people who wanted Republican control of the state and federal governments. And that's insightful. It turns out that on these particular issues, maybe not on all issues, but on these types of issues, Republicans and those who appreciate Republicans being in charge of government tended to have more cohesive point of view. There was more diversity on the side of people who prefer democratic control. And I think that's interesting. This suggests these particular issues play out differently in the Democratic coalition than in the Republican coalitions. One question that's been raised is how do the current levels of polarization compare?
Can you
yes.
please stop sharing your screen?
Oh, do I need to stop?
Yes, please.
Okay, did it stop?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. One question that I'd like to address is a really good one. How do the current levels of polarization compare to previous elections? The level of polarization that we see in the 2022 data is significantly higher than it was in 2018. Now, that was the first midterm election when Donald Trump was president. And true to form, there was a midterm slump. The Democrats were able to take over the House of Representatives. But if we compare these numbers to the numbers from the survey we took in 2018, it's a much higher level of polarization among Ohioans today than there was back then. You see it partly in the shifts of party identification, but partly in the increases in the levels of favorability that people have towards their own party, whatever that may be, but also their hostility to people that are towards the other party, the party that they don't belong to or don't feel close to. So we do see here in Ohio, what we see at the national level was increased polarization. Although the questions are not always comparable, it does appear to me that Ohioans are somewhat less polarized in 2022 than the nation as a whole. And that's interesting because historically, Ohio's been seen as a bellwether state, which very accurately reflects national attitudes. In fact, there's a question on that. And Ohio's long been known as a bellwether for the nation. Do you think these results reflect national attitudes? You know, I think on some of the particular issues, Ohioans do mirror the national issues, I think, really pretty accurately. But if you look at the totality of the data that we presented, Ohioans are a little bit different. I don't think they're quite having the bellwether role, may not quite have the bellwether role that the state has had in the past. There still is a kind of Ohio distinctiveness, but it's not as evenly divided between the parties as it has been in the past. Now, partly that's, I think, an effect of the Trump campaign in 2016 and 2020, and also in some demographic shifts that accompanied that change. Whether they were caused by President Trump or he simply responded to them is a really interesting question. And that is some of the traditional Democratic constituencies in Ohio, particularly white working class voters, many of whom have been voting Republican in various particular campaigns, have moved more in the Republican direction. You know, whether that's a permanent shift or not remains to be seen, but I think that has moved Ohio from being a very accurate bellwether of the country to being still a competitive state, but not as accurate as it has been in the past. So another question is, who do you think will be the Republican candidate for the Senate And how greatly will their campaign messaging change between May and November? Well, I really don't know. We'll run the Republican primary next Tuesday. It's interesting because it's been very, very competitive. The most recent polls have shown that the endorsement of Donald Trump for one of the candidates, J.D. Vance, apparently helped his fortunes, and he has moved ahead in some of the polls. But because there are multiple candidates, being ahead means getting between 25 and 30% of the vote. So there's a lot of other possibilities there. So it's just not clear to me who will win. But because of the intensity of the Republican primary senatorial campaign with multiple candidates with different perspectives, I think we will see whoever the nominee is likely change their approach for the general election. For one thing, they'll no longer be arguing with each other. They'll be trying to unite the Republican electorate and then, of course, appeal to other voters in Ohio. And many of the issues that animated the internal debate in the Republican Party may not be of interest or even really very positive for general election voters. This is not a new insight. This happens in a lot of elections, but I think it may be particularly important in this case because of the heat of the primary and also the diversity of the candidates that were involved there. A related question to one of the ones we dealt with earlier was, has the share of independent voters decreased or decreased? It's actually decreased. The number of people who are pure independents is roughly 5% smaller in this survey than in our comparable survey done back in 2018. But the leaders have also changed. A fair number of people who leaned independent, who said they were independent but leaned Republican, now classify themselves as strong Republicans. And we've seen some shifts over on the Democratic side as well. So part of the process of polarization is that the middle of the electorate, people who are independents, tends to sort of hollow out. Now, it is not the case in Ohio that there was nobody in the middle. There are actually quite a lot of voters in the middle, and many of them feel quite conflicted when they look at the Democratic and Republican positions on many issues. But there are fewer of them than there used to be. And I think that helps explain some of the dynamics that we'll see in the fall election. Again, it's unclear to me that these changes that we see in our survey, but a lot of other people see in their surveys, will be permanent. A lot will probably depend on what actually happens in 2022 and what happens afterwards, depending on who wins the election. Let me address another question down here. So one of the questions is, so Republicans have an advantage. What can Democrats do in the next few months to make up ground in the election? Well, it's a really good question. A lot of the background conditions, things that, for instance, might lead people to say that the country's on the wrong track or that the state's on the wrong track, those conditions probably can't be altered by any given candidate. However, they can be addressed. And I think part of the challenge for Democrats in an environment that, for historic as well as contemporary reasons, favors the Republicans, is to make the best case for circumstances. But of course, that's looking to the president and even to the past. One of the things that all candidates, I think, can do productively in this kind of environment is to offer them ways that they can distinguish themselves from their opponents. And a forward-looking agenda by Democratic candidates may turn out to be very helpful in Ohio in this kind of circumstance. But I think we may see some different strategies for the federal elections in Ohio, the Senate and congressional races versus the state level elections. And that's because of the different views of the nation and the state. Clearly, a large portion of Ohioans across the political spectrum are unhappy with the direction of the United States. But we have a solid majority of Ohioans that are reasonably happy with the direction of the state. So it may very well be that a campaign for governor will have a different tenor to it than a campaign for the Senate or for the congressional seats. Well, another question that's come up is, to what extent does this polarization that we've looked at, to what extent is that really a product of ideology? Is partisanship, which we usually think of as people's favorable attitudes or unfavorable attitudes towards parties, party leaders, party activists, to what extent is that really ideology? People are becoming more conservative or more liberal? It's a really very good question. Our survey suggests that people have not become markedly, Ohioans have not become markedly more liberal or more conservative or more moderate when it comes to ideology. But what's happened is something that we've seen across the country, and that is that liberals are increasingly sorting themselves into the Democratic Party, and conservatives are increasingly sorting themselves into the Republican Party. Now, where are the moderates to go? Well, this is tough, because as the Democrats become a more consistently liberal party and the Republicans become a more consistently conservative party, we have a two-party system. We don't really have a moderate party where a lot of those people can go. So there's a lot of conflicted views among the moderates in the middle. So part of what we're seeing here is the shifting of ideologues so that ideology and party match up more consistently. It wasn't that long ago that there was a conservative wing to the Democratic Party and there was a liberal wing to the Republican Party. At the national level, those wings are rapidly disappearing. They may actually be gone in many states. And I think we see Ohio following suit in that regard. So for instance, some of the shifts of upper status individuals who used to always vote Republican towards the Democratic Party is part of that change, but also the movement of many working class voters in a more conservative direction is part of that change as well. And it could be, when the history of this era is written, that people will look back and see some really dramatic reorganization of the underlying basis of partisanship, with the result being much more ideologically consistent parties. There's some really good things about that. You kind of know what Republicans and Democrats stand for, but there's also some really bad things about that. It doesn't work for all voters, and it also makes it extremely difficult to govern once the elections are over. There's a good question about geographic insights. The question was the strength of polarization recorded evenly across Ohio? In our survey, which is a big survey, 1,550 people, we could look at 4 of the 5 traditional regions of Ohio with some degree of confidence. And that's Northeastern Ohio, Southwestern Ohio, Central Ohio, and to a little bit lesser extent, Northwestern Ohio. In those 4 regions, the shift, the polarization seems to be about the same, suggesting that the people who are moving in all of the regions of Ohio. Now, we don't have enough cases to say with any confidence what's happening in the Appalachian part, that's southeastern Ohio, but the numbers that we do have suggest that it's happening there as well. Now, if part of what's going on is ideological sorting, and then that kind of makes sense, because we might see, even though Northeastern Ohio is the most liberal part of the state, we might be seeing the liberals concentrating themselves in the Democratic Party and the conservatives in the Republican Party, and a very similar pattern happening in Southwestern Ohio, the Cincinnati area, which is one of the traditional Republican and more conservative areas of the state. What could happen if this trend were to continue is that some of the distinctiveness of the 5 regions of Ohio will be diminished, because ideology will outweigh local regional differences. So here's a question. Several recent news stories have focused on the way polarization in Ohio politics has led to incidents of instability. Should we anticipate more of this in the general election? And what do you think the effect this has had on voter attitudes towards politicians and towards government? Unfortunately, we have seen a steady rise in incivility. I think political polarization does tend to foster incivility. One could imagine theoretically how it wouldn't, but in fact, it generally does. So I think we may be in for increased incivility, or at least not a diminution of incivility as we move into the fall election. And if the election becomes close, which it could, even though there are some big strengths for Republicans, individual races could become quite close. We may see, repeated incidents of incivility. Certainly, this is turning off a lot of voters. Something that I didn't present on is a standard question we've asked for many years about what people feel about the political process. Are they generally satisfied, or are they unsatisfied? What we see is that people in Ohio are less satisfied with the political process than they were a few years ago. These measures, vary a good bit according to how intense a political conflict is in particular elections and between elections. But one of the interesting things in that data is that people are much more unhappy with politics at the national level. Ohioans are much less happy with politics at the national level than they are at the state level. There are a lot of people in Ohio that don't like our politics in the state, but those very same people are much more unhappy with what they see at the national level. And of course, a lot of that has to do with what goes on in Washington, where the different factions in the Congress have been at loggerheads, and where a lot of the debate over hot button issues occurs. One question is a perennial question. It's a good one. What do you think of the prospects for a serious third party in Ohio or national politics? Right now, I don't see much in the way of prospects for, we have minor parties in Ohio. We have them, across the country. I think they play a really important role. Every once in a while, they act as a balance wheel. When the major parties collectively get out of sync with voters, the minor parties, or as we sometimes call them, third parties, have an opportunity to kind of bring the major parties back to where most voters are. I don't see that happening this year or next year in the next year's presidential election, 2024, which begins officially in January of 2023. So it's right around the corner. And the reason I don't see room for a serious third party at this point is because the country is so polarized. And while there are people in the middle who are very unhappy, they're unhappy in different ways. They're conflicted in different ways. If you think back to Ross Perot, one of the most successful third-party efforts in American history, he didn't win any states in the presidential election of 1992, but he got close to 1/5 of the vote nationwide. Perot spoke for a group of people who could agree on several things. For instance, the balanced budget, and greater fiscal responsibility. And the Democrats and the Republicans were not talking about those issues in a way that those voters cared about. And it had a big effect on national politics. So, the person who won that election was Bill Clinton, and he moved the Democratic Party in what, by the standards of the day, would have be considered a more fiscally responsible direction. I don't see that happening today. I see the energy as being on the progressive side, on the conservative side. And while there are people who could respond theoretically to a serious third-party effort, I just don't see the common ground which could bring that together. Now, nobody predicted Ross Perot, so maybe it will be that right around the corner, there's somebody or some group that can offer that kind of corrective and maybe help reduce the level of polarization in our politics. But I just don't see that right now. I think what we're going to do is continue this polarization for some time going forward. I have another question here, which I think is really interesting, and that is one of the viewers picked up on the fact that I noted that there's not as much controversy about elections and election reform in Ohio as there is in other states, and therefore in the national debate. And they were wondering why that was. And, I think it's because we've run our election really very well here in Ohio for a number of years. Back in the 2000 election, everyone I'm sure remembers the situation down in Florida with the hanging chads and a lot of questions about who actually won that election. Ohio had some of those same problems, but that election wasn't close, and in Ohio, so there wasn't as much controversy. But since then, there have been a series of reforms. We've had Republican Secretary of States and Democratic Secretaries of States and an army of election officials at the local and precinct levels who've done a really good job in addressing those problems. So Ohio has been blessed not to have the kind of ballot conflicts that have occurred in other countries. I mean, in other, not other countries, other states. But even in the real difficulties of conducting elections during the pandemic, we just didn't have the kind of problems in Ohio that occurred elsewhere. Of course, generating a lot of conflict and controversy. So I guess I was just a little bit surprised that those national debates had influenced Ohio voters in a way that they influenced voters nationwide. Because we just haven't seen those kinds of problems with elections in Ohio as we've seen in other countries. Well, we have another question here, which is about what are the factors behind the measures that lead people to assess a country or a state as being on the wrong track versus the right track? It's a really good question. Now, a lot of work has been done trying to tease out what leads people to assess things one way or another. But let me say at the outset, one of the reasons that pollsters, academic as well as those who advise campaigns, like to use the right track, wrong track measure is because of its ambiguity. It's really very general. And what you're getting is a sense of how people are with the way, how happy people are or unhappy they are with how things are going. So it's a really powerful measure when it comes to campaigns and to assessing the views of the electorate. But the very vagueness of the measure begs the question, well, what are people upset about? And the answer is they're upset about a lot of different things. But one of the standard findings of the literature on right and wrong track measures is that the state of the economy plays a really important role. When people feel that the economy is going reasonably well for them or for their communities, they tend to be more likely to say that the state or the nation's on the right track. On the other hand, if there's high levels of unemployment, if there are high levels of inflation, if interest rates are high, and then that tends to lead people to think that their state or the country's on the wrong track. So part of the right track, wrong track is very likely an assessment of the economy. And as we're coming out of the pandemic, of course, we have lots of economic problems, lots of economic disruptions. But of course, it's not just the economy. There are other factors as well. Other factors that the literature has identified are issues like crime and disorder. We have some examples of that in many cities. We've seen increases in the crime rate. We also have other kinds of disorder in the country. But then debates over cultural issues, things like abortion and homosexuality, often play into that because there's another sense of disruption in people's lives, but whether they're people on the progressive side or people on the conservative side. So, so there are a lot of things that go into the right track, wrong track numbers, but the economy typically tends to be the bigger part of that. Well, we have time for just a couple of other questions. One question is, what do you anticipate in terms of voter turnout for the 2022 election? You know, one of the most difficult things to assess in surveys is people's behavior. Surveys do reasonably well with attitudes, but behavior is difficult to predict. Generally speaking, voting in midterm elections is lower than it is in presidential elections. So I suspect that we will see, lower levels of turnout in Ohio that compared to 2020. And as I'm sure many of you know, there was a great and dramatic increase in the level of voter turnout in Ohio and across the nation in 2020. There was also an increase in 2018 compared to the previous midterm election, 2014. And we may very well see those 2018 levels of turnout be maintained in 2022. We may actually see a further increase in voting in the midterm election. But one of the things to know about midterm elections is turnout is often differential across parties. One of the things that creates the midterm slump is that the partisans of whoever's in the White House are often discouraged and don't turn out to vote, at the same levels that they voted for in the presidential election when the occupant of the White House was elected. On the other hand, the partisans of the losers tend to be, in the presidential election, tend to be whipped up and excited and intense and tend to turn out and vote at higher rates. So one of the interesting things about 2022 is not just what will the level of turnout be, but what will the differential be between Democratic voters, independent voters, and Republican voters. Wouldn't be at all surprising if Republican voters turned out in large numbers, given the patterns of the midterm slump. But interesting to see what happens with Democratic voters, and what about those independents, many of whom feel disconnected from the political process because of polarization. Well, we have time for just one more question, and I think it's a really good one, and that is, where can I find out more about this survey and look in more detail at some of the findings? And I have good news. This presentation, as well as a fuller report of our survey findings, will be posted on the Bliss Institute website momentarily. Feel free to go and look at it. The recording of this presentation and our Q&A will be posted as well. So if you have need additional information, that's the first place to turn. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. Thanks for being with us today as we share with you some really interesting data about the upcoming 2022 general election here in Ohio. I want to remind everybody to turn out and vote in the primary next Tuesday, and I wish you all a good day.